So now we're going to have a look at modulation. Now modulation is similar in Massive X to how it was implemented in the first instance of Massive. Now what we use modulation for is to change parameters over time. So you can imagine if you found a cool sound by dragging a parameter up and down, for example, the filter frequency, then rather than having to kind of risk getting RSI, you could have another parameter on the synthesizer do it for you. Originally, when it was put onto synthesizers when they were first designed, it was to allow you to create real-world sounds like vibrato and tremolo and wah-wah. And it's kind of gone on to take on really a life of its own. So it allows you to introduce expression into your playing, and it allows you to change the contour of a sound over time. That could be the volume, it could be the timbre, it could be the pitch. So it's really open-ended in terms of what we can modulate. Now in later videos we're going to have a look at the modulation sources, and in this video we're just going to have a look at the way in which modulation is implemented. Now the way that modulation works in Massive X is using a drag and drop approach. So what we can do is use these crosshair tools here, and as I click and hold and move it around, you'll see these little boxes appear here, and I can drop them into the box that I want to control, or the box of the parameter that I want to control. Okay, so before we go into actually creating some modulation, let's have an overview of where things are located. Okay, so let's have a look at our modulation sources. Now, first of all, you can see that our main modulation sources are grouped into three. So we have performers here, we have three envelopes here. Now, envelope 1, you can see here is the amp envelope. That's hardwired because we need an envelope to control our amplitude. We then have three LFOs and another group of modulators here, which has an envelope, an LFO, and another LFO. But bear in mind, of course, these can all be changed. So by clicking here, we can actually choose a different option, for example, another envelope. And then we have four trackers. Now these allow us to control parameters by using MIDI pitch as a modulation source. So we can define exactly how we want a parameter to respond to the pitch of the MIDI keyboard. And then finally, we have voice randomization. That allows us to vary our sound randomly. So I'm going to apply this LFO 2 to the wavetable. Let's bring up the level of this wavetable, and in fact we'll turn down the level of the first wavetable. Now at the moment we simply have it assigned, but we haven't decided how much amount we're going to use to affect the parameter. I do that by clicking and dragging up and down. Now if I go positively, it means that the parameter is going to be moving positively first, then negatively. Now this is an LFO, which is a bipolar modulator. It modulates up and down through a central line. So it's going to go positive and negative. Now if I did this in the opposite direction, it would first move negatively and then positively. Let's have a listen to how this sounds. It's hard to actually hear any difference because it's the same kind of style of modulation, it's just happening in a different direction. So that's the trademark sound of a low frequency oscillator affecting the wavetable position. Now we also have a sidechain modulator. Now we're going to come back to that in a minute. Now something else you may notice is that these rings are color coded. So you'll see that with this envelope here, we've got a blue modulation amount, whereas it was green for the LFO. And you'll see for the envelope, it's only moving positively. And that's because this modulation envelope, modulator 7, is unipolar. So it's only moving in one direction positively. Because I dragged it up, could go in the other direction if I dragged it down, but it's not going across a central point. And we can delete modulation by right-clicking and choosing delete. And we can also choose to right-click on the modulation source down here. We can choose to mute or bypass all connections or delete all connections. Okay, so let's have a look at the sidechain modulation. Now the sidechain modulation allows us to control the amount of modulation we apply using a modulation source via another modulation source. Now that may sound complicated, but let's think of an example which will help make it clearer. Let's say, for example, we wanted the LFO to affect the filter cutoff, or the filter frequency as it's called in Massive X. But rather than just having it statically working as soon as we press a key, we wanted to fade that in. So we wanted a slow onset of this modulation. What we could do is say, okay, I want an LFO to affect the filter frequency, but I want to do that via an envelope. An envelope allows us to introduce a slow attack. That slow attack applied to the LFO will mean we gradually fade in the amount of modulation. So let's look at how we do that in practice. So we'll bring the filter frequency down. Let's just check on our routing where we're at. So we have the sound passing through the filter. So let's apply an LFO, give it some amount, and we've got that trademark wobbling filter sound. Okay, let's take this modulation envelope, but let's drop it into this middle slot. Now this is our sidechain modulation slot. Now just bear in mind, by clicking and dragging as normal, we can use this as a direct modulation slot as well if we want to. Double click to take that off. But we can also use, as I said, this middle slot as sidechain modulation, and that means it'll affect any modulation either side. So let's just click and drag this upwards, and we're now assigning the amount this is going to affect the parameter. Now let's bring up a very slow attack. Make it a bit slower. Okay, let's actually bring this off. So you hear that direct, immediate LFO modulation of the filter as opposed to this slow attack bringing that effect in slowly. Now we can use this sidechain modulation in two different directions. So we could have that slowly bringing the effect in. Alternatively, we could invert it. So we slowly bring the effect out. And let's actually put another modulator into here, and you can see now a second amount slot appears here. Let's click onto this LFO here, and let's turn the rate up so we can definitely hear a difference. Let's change the shape. So you'll hear both those modulators, LFO 4 and 6, are now slowly being brought in via our envelope, and that is sidechain modulation.